Welcome to another episode of God-Sized Stories. This week, I have Amy with us. Amy, tell us about yourself.
Hey, Craig. Thanks for having me today on your podcast. I am Amy. I'm a mom and a wife. I work as a preschool director at Early Learning Village.
Awesome. For the audience that knows me well, some of them know me as well as Mr. Craig.
Yes, that's how I know you.
And that's how we've gotten to know each other all the more. I've known you for a few years from doing different church things together, but really in the preschool setting has been such a great way to get to know you more. To see your heart for kids and families has been such a blessing for me. But we're going to spend some time today talking a little bit about your family, how it's a little unique, and then a bigger idea that comes from your family, and that's the idea of foster care. But I want to go back, though, and hear your history with foster care, because it's not just about your family. It's so much more than that.
Yeah. Before I was the director of the preschool here, I used to work in social services, and I was a foster care caseworker. And then after I got my master's degree, I went into management and middle management with foster care and independent living programs with DCFS. Most of that was before I had children. So that's my history with social services and with foster care in particular. Nice.
So I want to get into a little bit of your family and your family's journey with foster care.
Yeah, we have 3 biological children. We have 2 girls and a boy. And after I started working first I started working at Early Learning Village as an assistant and then a teacher, and then eventually I became the director. Prior to that, I had started to sense that foster care might be something that our family should consider. We were busy parents like everybody else and had growing children, and so I would just occasionally say to my husband, hey, I think maybe one day we should think about fostering. And I remember him saying, sure, because he doesn't always tell me no. But he would say, yeah, sure, maybe one day when we retire, the kids are older, we don't have so much on our plate, maybe we could think about it then. So it's always been part of me, you could kind of say, that maybe for the future is kind of how it was for me. But after working at Early Learning Village, I met a little kiddo who I knew was going to be needing a home pretty soon. And that's how we became involved with foster care and actually fostering quicker than we thought that we would, for sure.
So what's like the timeline? I know yours is a little more unique. We'll get into a little bit later the process for what standard would look like, but give us a timeline then of your family in that situation.
Yeah, so I had just gone back to work after taking some time off, raising our children, and I was working at Early Learning Village, like I said, and there's this little kiddo who I knew was going to need a home, and I just said, we'll take him. And I hadn't talked to my husband about it or anything. And the timeline was, somebody looked at me and said, you would really? And I said, of course we would. A couple days later, she came back to me and she said, were you serious? And I said, of course I was. And she said, well, there's a chance that maybe you could. And so then I looked at her and I said, I should probably talk to my husband. So he and I went out for dinner, and I explained what had happened and just the events leading up to that, and how the Lord really had opened doors to make it a possibility, and a possibility to come quickly. And he's really the unsung hero in this story, because he just said, well, with all of that, I don't know how we could say no. So we said yes. And 6 weeks later, which is unheard of.
That's quick.
That's beyond quick, especially when you think about the bureaucracy in social services.
Wow, that's quick.
6 weeks later, he was placed in our home. And that was 4.5 years ago. Wow. Actually, over 4.5 years now. That's unusual. It doesn't happen that quickly usually, but it was because we knew him, or I knew him. because he was in my class at Early Learning Village at ELV. So that's how it came to be that he was able to be placed pretty quickly with us. And because it was an emergent need, like it was an urgent need.
Sure.
So yeah, that was the timeline.
So I guess we'll get into this next question as well. It can definitely reflect on that idea of how quickly it was. What was the transition then like for your family? Because this, that's a lot of differences. You go from 3 kids to 4 kids.
Yeah.
This is it's not like it's a baby, which makes things different. This is a child that is
a little
bit older. So like all those are drastic changes for a family. What was that like?
For the most part, they were all in. He, again, a little bit unusual in foster care. He visited our home a few times. We were trying to help his current foster family out with some childcare that they needed a little childcare. So we did a little babysitting before he came to live with us. And so they got to meet him first. And so in that respect, they were all in. I mean, I remember he was home one day when my girls got home from school, and the shriek of, oh! But it was also a transition. Like you said, it's sharing a room and learning to share parents and the needs of a child. There was also some transition time for them too, in figuring out how to do life differently. With another little one in the home. Yeah,
because like even we were talking about this earlier. Even just bringing in another biological child can drastically change the dynamics between I'm not the baby anymore. Yeah. Maybe I'm the double middle child now, and that can be difficult. And so 6 weeks can really come at you.
Well, and they didn't even, when we started babysitting, we didn't know for sure that he was going to come live with us. So it was actually less than 6 weeks that
for them. Yeah.
We had a sneaking suspicion, but we still hadn't been told for sure by the agency that we would be. But for them, it was even shorter than 6 weeks.
Let's move on and let's talk. We have a little bit of your family history background with it. Let's talk bigger picture though. I know every process will be unique because every family is different, every child is different, but there is more of a standard baseline for people that are just curious. They might have no idea about foster care. What would be the standard?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like you said, it's varied by agency, but it's also the same because DCFS requires the same kinds of paperwork and things to be done regardless of where you get licensed through. An agency does a home study, so they have a worker that comes out to your house at least 3 times to meet with individuals and the couple, the family unit. They ask you a lot of questions about your history, and so that's part of their home study is figuring out you as people, you as a family, the children. You're fingerprinted, so the adults in the home.
Oh, yeah, background.
Yep, background checks are done. Medical forms are required, so all the kids, my husband and I both had to, we all had to get physicals. They look at your house, they look at the surroundings. DCFS have guidelines on how much space is required for certain things.
Sure.
So just looking at your physical house. I'm just looking for things that might be hazards for kids or things that might be problematic and what things are good for kids. You do some training. The training actually takes a little bit of time. So if you're truly interested in becoming a foster parent, getting enrolled in those trainings are really important to keep the ball rolling. You learn a lot of things about kids with trauma, where the trauma comes from, how trauma rewires a person, rewires their brain, and how that might actually manifest itself. You learn about advocating for kids with their education, how to navigate, and the importance of biological connections for the foster child, and learning to try to appreciate those biological connections and keep those connections strong. So those trainings are actually helpful. They're very helpful in trying to get yourself ready, get your family prepared for welcoming someone into your home. Once the training is finished and your paperwork is finished, there are a few other things that the agency, depending on where you go, does with your house and with your family, but that's about it. The process can take short amount of time or a long amount, long.
Well,
So it depends.
as we talked about bureaucracy before, it's
Yeah.
it's up in the air. You never know, and it's probably going to be longer in most cases than you expect because red tape is that for a reason.
Yes, and I always say our story is mostly unique that way. Most children are not placed that quickly, for sure.
I'm just so excited to have this conversation about this with you, because I love the idea of foster care and then eventual adoption type situations. It's been really big for me and my family's in my life. It's been both in my family's life, but also my wife's family. There's been adoption. My mom spent a long time as a child in the foster in the foster care system, and my sisters were adopted because my mom saw the need for such things. So it just makes me excited to see people making an impact in that system on both sides. You on one point, we're on one side of it, now you're on the other side of it. Right. And it's just encouraging to see that and to hear that. For people that want to know more ideas, like tips and advice that people have, because as I said, there could be people listening, they're on that fence, they're not quite sure if they should say yes, like you said before. Is like that was a big thing for you, saying yes. What are tips and advice or things for people to search in themselves to make that decision?
Yeah, I think that's always the $1 million question for sure. I always say that when you go into foster care, you have to recognize that the goal for the vast majority of foster kids is reunification with their biological family. And so understanding that, I think, is paramount, to be honest with you. Adoption does happen from foster care, but it's not the ultimate goal. And how we as people can support reunification and support the biological attachments, I think, is super important. So that is always one thing that I say off the bat for people who ask me about foster care is you really have to have an open heart and an open mind about all situations and all outcomes in foster care, but understanding that when at all possible, children should stay with their biological families, and think about, are you willing to support that and make a way? And by make a way, I mean support it fully. And it's sometimes hard. I mean, it's sometimes hard when you think about what the kids have been through and the outcome for them. But that's always my number one thing is have a heart to know that foster care is about reunification. And then past that, you do have to know that there are other outcomes that can happen, which sometimes is adoption, sometimes it's guardianship, sometimes it's just being a permanent resource for a child who might age out of the system, who doesn't really have much support in the community. So really just thinking about what does foster care mean and what could be and what is the best outcome for a child in your care.
That's really encouraging to hear, because that's actually that breaks even my concept of what some of the things are. I've not actually heard that before. So that's encouraging to hear that as the bigger process, which melts my heart a little bit, because I can totally see and hear and understand the whole having that biological connection. Like, we as a culture, I feel like, struggle with that right now, of knowing who you are, that whole identity issue. And the fact that they're keeping that in the forefront of policy is huge. Our first goal for kids in care is should be to support the biological families for kids to be able to return home. And there are kids who cannot return home. And I would never underestimate that, and I would never want kids who can't return home to go home to an unsafe situation. But I think it's important as a society that we try to support the biological families as best we can to see and to determine if really they can go home safely with some support. And then if they can't, then other things are appropriate and should be pursued. Like I said before, like with adoption or guardianship or whatever that may look like for the kids. Awesome. Well, Amy, do you have any more, less advice, more information where people could go if they want to know more about foster care, how to get involved in any way, shape, or form? Where would you recommend them to go?
There are certainly social service organizations in the community that have foster care programs, but there's an organization called Let It Be Us that is a more neutral organization that helps prospective foster parents get placed with the correct agency. So they help with the licensing process and then help families to either find an agency that suits their needs, or they help place children into homes that are licensed. And that's an organization that I would highly recommend. They also have a lot of good training. They're just a good organization. I feel like as a kind of a neutral place to get started. And you can find them at letitbeus.org. That's their website, and that's a great place to get started. You know, and in the process, while you're waiting to become licensed, or maybe you're not sure that you want to become licensed, foster families are always looking for respite. They're looking for, families who can occasionally take their child to help with just childcare, with appointments, with other things. That's another great way to be involved in the foster care system.
I just love it. This conversation's been so encouraging to me, especially, we didn't touch on it too much, but like the whole idea of with our faith too, like God told us to take care of the widows and the orphans. And it's like, yes, foster's slightly different than orphan, because as you were saying before, like the whole problem, the whole major goal is to get them reunited, but still, I would say God would still call us to that, like, take care of these children. Like, they need to be taken care of. So it just brings me joy to hear people talk about having passion for it. Because we both have a passion for children. And so that's why we work at a preschool. We love it. Our passion comes out. It's impossible to contain. But just seeing people care about children just has always brought me joy. So thank you so much for doing that in many directions. I mean, it's been a joy to work with you. It's been a joy to sit and discuss all these things with you. I fell into the trap, as I always too often do, when I tell people, they ask, "Oh, how long is this going to take?" 30, 40 minutes. Don't worry about it. We'll be in and out. And then we sit and we talk for an hour before we start recording, and that's my habit, sadly. But
that was great, actually.
It's because the joy comes out of especially talking about stuff like this. And it's so exciting to hear work being done for people all over the world like this.
Yeah, I think it's, a lot of times you think you're going to, when you're working with kids, you think that they're going to be blessed by you and you're going to do so much for them. But you always know that at the end, you're the one that's blessed.
Amen.
That they change us in a way that really nobody else can. And so it's really our family that's been blessed by being available to foster.
Amen. Well, Amy, thank you so much for all of that.
Thank you, Craig.
And audience, thank you so much. As always, I couldn't do this without you.